Caucus, and I welcome you all to the last session of Compass presented by Cordelia School of Public Policy on behalf of Caucus, the discussion forum. It gives me immense pleasure to announce that this year marks the 4th edition of Compass, 15th anniversary of Caucus, and 125 years of Hindu College. This session will be a moderated book discussion on the recently launched book, Becoming Babasaheb. I would like to welcome our esteemed speaker for the session, the author of the book himself, Professor Aakash Singh Rathore. Welcome, sir. Before continuing, I would like to invite Mr. Amninder Yadav, the President of Caucus, to address the gathering.
थैंक यू राहुल। हमारे आज के प्रमुख वक्ता प्रोफेसर आकाश सिंह राठौर सर, हमारे आमंत्रित मित्र, कॉकस के मेरे साथी, प्रेस के बंधु, भाई और बहनों, सबसे पहले तो मैं आप सभी का बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद देना चाहूँगा कि आप आज हमारे कंपस, हमारे 2 दिन के कार्यक्रम का हिस्सा बन रहे हैं। मुझे लगता है आप सबकी मौजूदगी से हमारे प्रयास सार्थक हो रहे हैं। जैसे कि 2 दिन के कार्यक्रम में हमने तमाम जो हमारा विषय थे, चाहे वो पत्रकारिता हो, विदेश नीति हो, महिला सशक्तिकरण हो, जैसे तमाम विषय छुए, उनके बारे में जाना, सीखा, और जो हमारा प्रयास था कि तमाम विशेषज्ञों को एक मंच पे लाके छात्र छात्राओं के साथ संवाद की जो स्थिति है उसको पुनः आरंभ करें, उसमें मुझे लगता है हम सफल हुए हैं। तो इसके लिए मैं धन्यवाद देना चाहूँगा आप सभी को। साथ ही साथ इस मौके पे मैं धन्यवाद देना चाहूँगा हमारे टाइटल स्पॉन्सर कॉर्डेलिया स्कूल ऑफ पब्लिक पॉलिसी का और श्रीमान प्रतीक कंवल सर का, जिनकी वजह से हमें हर संभव रिसोर्स मिला आज के 2 दिन के हमारे कार्यक्रम को पूरा करने का। अंत में मैं कॉकस की मेरी टीम को धन्यवाद देना चाहूँगा और आप सभी का फिर से धन्यवाद देता हूँ। ज़्यादा समय न लेते हुए अपनी वाणी को विराम देता हूँ। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। जय हिंद।
What we have for you here today is a story. It is the story of a luminary. There was a time when Babasaheb had to spend the night at a public park because nobody would have him stay at his home because he was a so-called untouchable. But today he lives in the hearts of the millions of this nation, and we embrace him as the father of the Constitution of India. He was the primary source of opposition to Mahatma Gandhi during the second round table conference. It is believed, however, that the same Gandhi then recommended him for the post of chairman of the Constituent Assembly. Babasaheb Bhimrao Ambedkar exemplifies any good definition of the word stalwart. We, Caucus, the discussion forum, bring you his story of becoming Babasaheb, and to tell you the tale we have with us here today, Professor Rathore himself, the writer of this one-of-a-kind book. Professor Rathore has authored and edited close to 20 books that range from political philosophy, law, religion, sports, and wine. Sir has taught at prestigious institutions world over, of which some are Jawaharlal Nehru University, University of Delhi, University of Pennsylvania, University of Toronto, Humboldt Berlin, and Louis Rome. He is an international fellow of Athos, Rome, and a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study. Sir is the author of celebrated books, Ambedkar's Preamble and B.R. Ambedkar's Quest for Justice. Besides his academic accolades, which are numerous, Sir is also an Ironman triathlete. Now I would like to ask the moderators for this session, Milind Shekhar Singh and Siddhant Sinha, to escort Sir on the stage and begin the session. Before that, I would ask Anirudh, my friend Anirudh, to give a presentation on our topic.
A very good afternoon to one and all present here. I am Anirudh Mehta, a student of Statistics Honours first year. The forthcoming presentation seeks to analyze some significant events in the life of the father of the Indian Constitution, Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar. These are some events that had a far-reaching impact on Ambedkar's life and played a crucial role in shaping him as a person. I would also like the audience to know that in this presentation, we focus more on the impact of these events on the personal life of Babasaheb as opposed to his public life. Next slide. While visiting his father, who was posted in Koregaon at that time as an officer in the British Indian Army, a 13-year-old Ambedkar failed to find a mere Tonga ride from the railway station to his father's house. When he finally does find a ride, the otherwise 3-hour journey is completed in 12 hours, with the intermediate experience being a near nightmare. Ambedkar, in his own words, has described this event as one which gave him a shock that he had never received before. This incident completely changed Ambedkar's worldview on untouchability. Next slide. Ambedkar studied at the University of Columbia from the year 1913 to 1915. His time at Columbia shaped a lot of his views related to gender and also helped him shed a lot of the inferiority complex he carried as a so-called untouchable in India. This experience, therefore, went a long way in shaping Ambedkar's personality as a whole. Next slide. It is widely believed that the awakening of the Dalit consciousness began with the Mahad Satyagraha of 1927. This march was held in Kolaba near Bombay. Ambedkar, through the march, wanted to stake the claim of the untouchables in drawing water from public tanks, a basic right they were denied. In this march, he publicly burned copies of the Manusmriti as a symbol of resistance against upper caste domination. Next slide. Ambedkar made a historic declaration on 13th October 1935 at Yevala. Of what? Of his resolve to renounce Hinduism. Buddhism appealed to Ambedkar not only due to its focus on rationality, but also due to its egalitarian nature and Indic origins. Therefore, the advent of Buddha in Ambedkar's life played a huge role in shaping him as a person, and on 14th October 1956, Ambedkar converted to Buddhism with nearly 5 lakh people. This incident occurred 2 months before his eventual death on 6th December 1956. Next slide, please. With this, we come to the end of the presentation. I would now like to ask Rahul to take the session forward. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Anirudh, for such an informative presentation. Now again, I would like to invite the moderators, Milind Singh and Siddharth Sinha, to continue the session and escort sir to the stage.
Good afternoon, one and all. First of all, heartfelt gratitude to Professor Rathore for accepting our invite. It's truly an amazing experience for us, sir, to have you. Now, Becoming Babasaheb, Professor Rathore's latest work, was released just last week on the auspicious occasion of Ambedkar Jayanti. The first volume of a 2-part biography, Becoming Babasaheb, seeks to portray Dr. Ambedkar in a completely new light with a person-oriented approach. I'm sure Professor Rathore has been answering many questions repeatedly in the last few days in his book talk and discussions, but just as Becoming Babasaheb tries to portray Babasaheb in a fresh perspective, I hope that our questions will provide fresh breath to sir as well. To reiterate, the session will have a 45-minute moderated discussion followed by interaction with the audience. So to start the proceedings, sir, my first question would be, you have previously written and edited quite a few works on Babasaheb, including Ambedkar's Preamble and B.R. Ambedkar, The Quest for Justice. Moreover, there is already a vast literature dealing with the life of Dr. Ambedkar. This book, though, speaks of providing a fresh perspective on his life and history. So, sir, to start off the session, can you shed some light on how the book goes about doing this?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. Before I address it, let me just thank you all for coming and staying until the end. I'm sure you had quite a full day, possibly 2 full days, so I appreciate that you have come to share with us this discussion about the book. And of course, my thanks to all of you organizers of this event for all the efforts that you've put into it. And I've been following it on Twitter, and it looks like it's been quite a great 2 days. There have been a number of books written on Dr. Ambedkar, nowhere near as many as have been written about other stalwarts like Nehru or Gandhi. But each time that I have written on Ambedkar, it has made me aware of all of the gaps that exist. So every time I try to deal with one aspect of his very multidimensional life, take for example Ambedkar's Preamble, which I had worked on a few years ago, as much information as I found, new information on the authorship of the Preamble and so on, it only opened more questions. And that goes back for each of the books that I've written back to 2010 when I did a critical edition of the Buddha and his Dhamma. I had discovered a preface to that book written by Dr. Ambedkar that had never appeared in the published version for various reasons. And that preface was actually an autobiographical preface. It made me realize that there are elements of Ambedkar's personal life that have never come to light, and yet that had a big impact on what he wrote and what he did and why he wrote what he did. And for that reason, I wanted to go back to the beginnings. Who was Ambedkar? The personal story, the personal struggle, as just another attempt at a foundation from which we can start to build, again, reconstruct our ideas and you know, keep working on his life and his contributions.
Thank you so much for your response. My next question to you is that your work is essentially based on original archival records. And in that sense, you have extensively indulged in primary research on the life of Babasaheb Ambedkar. How do you describe this experience? And another question is, were there some intriguing or counterintuitive instances while you were doing your research which you can share with us?
Yes. Well, there's one word to describe that experience. But that one word has 2 very different meanings, and both of those meanings are important. And the word is privileged. I'm very privileged to have been able to access all of these archives and gain all of this information, much of it that has never seen the light of day. But at the same time, have to keep in mind that earlier biographers, especially from Ambedkar's own community, didn't have the privilege to do this sort of work. So the word has a double meaning because I have to recognize that when I correct the record from previous writings on Ambedkar, I don't do it with any kind of superiority complex or anything like that, but quite humbly because others have tried. In fact, today I received a WhatsApp message from a researcher in Nagpur who asked me if I could share with him some of the files that I had found in London because he's working on a manuscript and he, of course, can't afford a flight to London, a place to stay in London, the fees that require to access the archives and so on. So accessing those archives in New York, in London, even here in Delhi, in Mumbai, Bombay State Archives and Baroda State Archives. This is a truly wonderful privilege in both senses. Now, doing so really opens up a new world. In the British Library, India Office Documents section, there is a secret document section, which is one where not only can you obviously not go in with your phone or your camera, but they even discourage you to bring anything to write with, pen and paper. While these are sort of public documents, they want them tightly controlled and they don't really want them spread out. I have seen the secret documents of the government related to Ambedkar, and some shocking things have come to light in these files, which no one has really seen. One of them is a conspiracy between the Secretary of State at the time and the Viceroy himself, along with the leader of the Congress Party in Bombay, to offer Dr. Ambedkar a High Court judgeship in Bombay. Now, what's fascinating is that many biographies of Dr. Ambedkar talk about what a great legal mind he was, that he was offered a High Court judgeship. Now, of course, that's true. But a new story comes out when we find out that the motivation on the part of the leader of the Congress Party in Bombay at the time, he later became the Chief Minister of Bombay. His name is K. The motivation was to get this man out of public life. So once you're a High Court judge, obviously you're not going to Mahad, right? You're not doing temple entry campaigns, you're not giving public speeches, you're not leading a social movement that is obviously going to transform into a powerful political movement. And so the Congress leadership was very much on the side of recognizing Dr. Ambedkar's talents as a legal mind, but not to celebrate him, but to undermine him. So the new documents that I found, this is just one example of something that really changes the way that we can understand the trajectory of his past.
Sir, you have mentioned how Dhananjay Keer, an important figure in Ambedkar's biography, had this tendency of associating Ambedkar with Savarkar, even inaccurately at times. In the preface of your book, you have noted that he has even inserted fictitious conversations and meetings between the two. He hasn't, however, written about the differences that the two had. What do you think was the reason behind this? Was there an ideological inclination playing out here? And how has it influenced Babasaheb's understanding among the people?
So, yesterday, I have to tell you, I had dinner with a gentleman who works with the grandson of Dhananjay Keer. And apparently the grandson of Dhananjay Keer is a philanthropist, and he does a lot of great social work in provinces, Maharashtra. And this humanization of Dhananjay Keer's grandson made me realize that I need to recognize Keer as a person with a life and treat him with some respect. And I give him, a bit of punishment in the preface of my book, but I think now when I speak publicly, I want to be a little more gentle with him, now that I've been awoken to the fact that, he has children and grandchildren, and they are living lives today, and I don't think they would want me speaking about what a hack job he did on Ambedkar and so on. But facts are facts. His intentions I cannot say. I can't get into his mind. But if we read one's intentions from what they've actually done, his motivation was to bring his two heroes together, because he had a legitimate idolization of Ambedkar, and I think that you can see that when you read his biography. No animosity, nothing of the sort. He had a legitimate and profound reverence for Ambedkar. But he also had the same for Savarkar. And I think you might be aware that he wrote quite a definitive biography of Savarkar, as well as one about Ambedkar. And so what he seemed to want to do was to create some sort of universe where his two heroes were friends. And that maybe helped him to suture together this divided personality. That on the one hand I adore Babasaheb, and on the other hand I adored someone who Babasaheb thought of as an ideological enemy. Whatever his, I can't psychoanalyze him, but whatever his reasons, he did a lot of damage to both the history of understanding Ambedkar, because it has been a point of not shame but embarrassment that we have lived for 70 years with the most comprehensive English and Hindi biography of Ambedkar having Savarkar's endorsement on the back. And if you read Keir's book, the number of times that Savarkar's name appears, given the page length, if you statistically average it out, we had a statistician introduce, readers are forced to read the name Savarkar every 9 pages in Ambedkar's biography. That's absurd. So it has had this influence on Ambedkar's movement, because we're forced to be constantly reminded of this looming presence of Savarkar, even though it was a fiction. And on the other hand, you find that in Savarkar biographies, they often rely on Keir to show an affinity between Savarkar and Ambedkar. So Keir's fundamental strange desire to unify the two has changed the way that we see both of these figures. And that was part of what I needed to correct.
Thank you so much, sir, for your response. My next question is something which anybody who has read Ambedkar is intrigued with. Like, since the time I started reading Ambedkar, this question always intrigues me. Which is that, sir, whenever we read about Babasaheb and we see his portrait, he looks a rather serious figure with little or no expression. As mentioned in your book, his candid photos provide a very different Ambedkar. I saw a photo in your book which was with Sitaram Keshav Bole, probably the only photo where Ambedkar was seen smiling. So my question is that, sir, if we compare this to other leaders like Gandhi, we have seen many shades of Gandhi. We have seen him smiling, crying, protesting, rejoicing, but we don't get to see many shades of Ambedkar. So why do you think that almost all pictures of Babasaheb have this sort of seriousness intrinsic to them?
Yeah, that's an interesting phenomenon, and I am fortunate to be friends with Vijay Sorwada, who's the greatest collector of Ambedkar photos and memorabilia. In fact, it's quite shocking the kind of memorabilia he has. The first time I was invited into his house, as soon as I'm taking off my shoes and I stand back up, I'm confronted at face level with dentures, with teeth. And he says, these are Babasaheb's dentures. I was so taken aback to be face to face with these. So Sorade has a wonderful collection of photos, and this is where I discovered that when photos are candid, in other words, when Ambedkar doesn't know his photo is being taken, he's usually smiling, more often than not. Much more often than not, in fact, almost always. And as you rightly point out, in staged photos, or where he's aware of what's happening, he has a very stern look. Now, this was his necessitated by his public persona. He needed to project himself as no nonsense, as someone who could not be pushed around even by the Mahatma. As everyone knows, he was the only significant figure to stand up against Gandhi, which ultimately earned not only Gandhi's respect, but the respect of many others who would have liked to do the same, but didn't have the character, the courage to do so. Given that situation, that many, many people would have liked to have done the same, but didn't have that courage, Ambedkar projected what it took to be that figure, the figure who was not afraid of anyone, who was going to fight for his principles through thick and through thin, and against any adversary, even the most celebrated man in India. And that projection of his sternness and seriousness was necessary or useful to that enterprise.
Thank you, sir, for that interesting take. The book mentions that it is from the birth of Babasaheb to the Mahar Satyagraha, that is from 1891 to 1929. So,
actually 27, but I continue to the... Yeah.
So 1929. So is there a reason behind choosing the Mahar Satyagraha in particular, dividing the two biographies? Was there a induction point in the life of Babasaheb as well that you chose this particular year?
Yes, I think, so there are two ways to address that. One is that I don't believe that biographers and historians have recognized how crucial Mahar Satyagraha was to changing Ambedkar, to changing his approach to politics and society, to changing his approach about expectations of the Hindu majority, what he could expect, because of the level of violence. Now, Ambedkar had always experienced violence when carrying on temple entry campaigns or supporting temple entry campaigns. And that, I think he of course thought was horrible, but I think he could understand the kind of nerve, the sensitivity that it touched in the Orthodox and the reactionary Hindus. But what he could never fathom was simply the use of a public good, like a road or water. He could never fathom why the use of water, something so essential and basic, would result in so much violence. And that realization was crucial to the way that he led his movement from that point onward. So the period from 1927 to 1935, where he makes that declaration that he will not die as a Hindu. This is a kind of denouement, a kind of, everything is coming to a head now. And it is from Mahar that this change in him really occurs. The second way to see it is that, I should mention that, in fact, the second volume is not titled Becoming Babasaheb. The first volume is titled Becoming Babasaheb, and the running kind of unity is the life and times of Bhimrao Ambedkar. The second volume has another title, The Passion of Ambedkar, but that's coming later. So what I'm doing in Becoming Babasaheb is, and I think for the first time, trying to understand how Biva Ambedkar, against all odds, Biva Ambedkar, this young boy born around 1891 with no means and no certainty in his future. All of his siblings go off as laborers in the mills, and how this person changed from Biva Ambedkar to Bhimrao Ambedkar, and then from Bhimrao Ambedkar to Ambedkar Bar at Law, and then from Ambedkar Bar at Law to Dr. Ambedkar, and then from Dr. Ambedkar to Babasaheb. And so the Mahar struggle tells us that final stage. The book narrates each of these stages, but the Mahar struggle tells us this is the final stage where he has done something so historic, and historic in the world, because civil rights was an issue not only in India but throughout the world, and this was one of the first moments of civil disobedience for civil rights that transformed him into becoming Babasaheb.
Thank you so much, sir, for your insight. My next question to you is that we often see different camps. Some link Ambedkar to capitalism and say that he was a supporter of free market economy, while others quote that his contributions such as foundation of the Independent Labour Party, and they often praise Ambedkar's association with socialism. So while going through your book, I read this chapter titled An Indian in New York, where you mentioned that Ambedkar had enrolled in 5 full courses on Marxism and socialism. And for the same, he would have had to purchase at least some of Karl Marx's works. But an intriguing fact is that his majority of his books did not return to India because the ship which was carrying them met with an accident. But what you mentioned is that he never made an effort to repurchase any works of Karl Marx, which surprisingly found no space in Ambedkar's extant library. And later on, he went on to establish the Independent Labour Party, and obviously quoting some of Babasaheb's contributions, such as formation of equal pay for equal pay for men and women, and also contributions like maternity fund. So we often see that he did a lot to bring out some reform in labor laws. So sir, my question is, how do you see Babasaheb's association with socialism and Marxism?
This is a very important question, very significant question. And I think we can very easily dismiss the first part about seeing him as a capitalist and so on. Many of his speeches say that there are 2 fundamental problems in India. One, of course, is Brahmanism, which is clear, but another, capitalism. And he had always fought against plutocracies and the likelihood that an independent India would certainly evolve very quickly or devolve into a plutocracy as opposed to a socialist republic. So we can dismiss that. And of course, the constitution that he himself wrote out by hand, which is entitled States and Minorities, was a hardcore socialist constitution. Now the mystery is why between the authorship and the publication of States and Minorities, Ambedkar's own constitution, and the constitution of the Republic of India, why this strong socialist dimension, which included nationalized industries, collective farming, classic socialist, in fact Soviet practices, why they disappeared from the constitution. Well, it certainly wasn't Ambedkar's doing. That was dictates of the liberals in the Congress party who wanted that. So we can dismiss that. But his relationship to Marx, Marxism, socialism, and socialists, and communists is multi-layered, and it lasts throughout the extent of his life. There are, you've mentioned the formation of the Labour Party. You mentioned his many enrolling in more courses than he needed to at Columbia. But you didn't mention, and in fact I thank you because this book only goes up to 1929, that throughout the 1950s he was fixated obsessively on Marx and Marxism. His final speeches discussing a choice between Karl Marx or the Buddha. Now at that time, why in the 1950s? Because of what we call the domino effect. Soviet Union was a serious threat throughout South and Southeast Asia for converting these weak states into communist states. So it's no coincidence that when Ambedkar made these speeches on Buddha or Karl Marx, that he did it in Southeast Asia, which were countries at risk. But well before the 1950s, his experience with Marxism theoretically was very fruitful, and it informed him a great deal. But his interactions with Marxists and communists was far from fruitful. They constantly betrayed him, and he finally realized that this is, ironically, a Brahminical party, a Brahminical movement. While it claims to be a labor movement, it is totally indifferent to the fate of the depressed classes, the scheduled castes, and that component of labor from the scheduled caste. So his personal interactions and experiences with practicing communists colored the way that he eventually looked at Marx himself. If Marx could be so perverted so that those pursuing his extremely attractive ideological goals could in fact turn out to be as casteist as anyone else, then there must be something missing in Marxism. But it is a very multi-layered and complex relationship that he had with Marxists and communists and so on.
Taking another cue from the same chapter, An Indian in New York, what effect do you see of his stay and his educational voyage in Columbia University on his intellectual growth and development of his caste analysis? It is often said that he was inspired by the race movement in America at the time, but as you have pointed out in the previous interview as well, he learned a lot from the gender debate and not the racial debate, and he drew an analogy between gender and caste. In fact, some of his earlier works were very similar to what many might find similar to the gender debate as well. So, what effect do you think of his stay in New York had on his caste consciousness?
Yes, so there is a movement. Dr. Ambedkar has become a global phenomenon, and there are writers writing works on Ambedkar, as many from the United States and France and Germany and the UK as there are in India today. Every one of these geographic regions has an interpretation that suits them, and the dominant one coming out of the United States, which we can see in Scott Stroud's recent book on Dewey and Ambedkar, and a bit on Anupama Rao's works and so on. The dominant thesis being pushed from the United States is that, Ambedkar came to us unformed, we formed him, and we send him back to you. Thank you, you're welcome. You can thank us later for what we've done. Now this is obviously not the whole story. From the Ambedkarite point of view, especially from the communities that share identities with him, who have overlapping identities, they make the essential point that Ambedkar's lived experience, which was described, for example, in Waiting for a Visa, as we heard in the introduction, these kinds of experiences are experiences that, unless you are from this community, Dalit, Bahujan communities, these are not our social realities, these are not our lived experiences. When you put these two things together, a kind of intellectual formation, which he received at Columbia, with the lived experience and his character, his history, his social context, when you put the two together, then you get the formation of an Ambedkar as a socially conscious intellectual. So what Columbia did was it pulled him out of places like any colleges or universities in Bombay, which never would have allowed him to liberate his mind and spark his imagination, because his caste identity would have been always stepping in the way of that. At Columbia, there was no caste identity to hinder him at all. So it freed him from that, so that his intellectual formation could be, really stamped on to a way that he can organize his lived experience. I think we would not have had a Dr. Ambedkar with such a profound sense of history, of learning, of obviously mastery of economics in both micro and macro fields, both fiscal policy, monetary policy. We wouldn't have had this much depth and intellectual encyclopedic knowledge had he studied even at the best institutions in India and even in the UK, because the imperialist and the constant surveillance of Indian students would never have given him that room to grow and expand. So the Columbia years are crucial to the Dr. Ambedkar that we have today, but the overemphasis on what Columbia, or what his time in America contributed, has to be pushed back against, because we realize that there were many students at Columbia, and there was only one, Ambedkar, who came out.
Thank you, sir, for your response. My next question is that, so if we see Baroda, the city of Baroda played a very significant role in Babasaheb's life. I remember 2 voyages of Babasaheb to Baroda where he was equally humiliated. And he had to go there because he had to fulfill his obligation to the Maharaja of Baroda. So, in the chapter Sleepless in Baroda, you have described a very emotional incident where Babasaheb was residing in a Parsi accommodation and he was kicked out by the Parsis. They threatened him to leave the space and said that you have polluted this place. And there was a very emotional line. Babasaheb said, and I quote, "I cursed all and wept bitterly. It was for the first time that I learned that a person who is an untouchable to a Hindu is also an untouchable to a Parsi." Even on his second voyage to Baroda, we see he could not find refuge. The only place safe for him was a public library, where he could sit and read. So, if I ask you, sir, what do you think, what role has Baroda played in Babasaheb's life, considering all the humiliating experiences he had? So, what impact did the Baroda particularly had on Babasaheb's life?
Baroda means many different things, because on the one hand, the social situation, when he thought about Baroda, as he states, he never thinks about his time in Baroda without weeping. This is part of why the next volume is called The Passion of Dr. Ambedkar, because I discuss how profoundly moved he is and how profoundly moving he is in his public and social life. So he could never think about Baroda without weeping, but that's the social situation. He also associates Baroda with Gaikwad, the Maharaja, to whom he dedicates his first 2 books are dedicated to his parents and to the Gaikwad. That's very significant, right? So he recognizes that had it not been for the state of Baroda, this Maharaja, he never would have received the education that was required, necessary condition for his leadership. So Baroda is significant. What I find fascinating is that in all of the forks in the road, so in every stage of Ambedkar's life, there were 2 different paths he could have chosen. I mentioned how he argued with his father after graduating from Elphinstone, should I go to Baroda or should I stay in Bombay? And his father said stay in Bombay, and he chose to go to Baroda. And of course his father had been right, because he was treated miserably. And I present many of these forks in the road, how things could have been different. But interesting about Baroda is that his initial scholarship was to study in London and not in Columbia. To study pedagogy, education in London, and not to study finance, sociology, politics in Columbia. And as I had just mentioned, had the original contract been signed to send Ambedkar from Baroda to London to study education, once again, we would not have had the Dr. Ambedkar that we have today, because Columbia offered him all kinds of freedom and perspectives. He would have been a wonderful and inspiring teacher, I imagine, graduating from University of London with a degree in education and coming back and being a teacher, but he would not have been, the father of our Constitution and all of the things that happened. One final thing just to mention, every single image of Babasaheb of which we are aware, every statue in this country, every time we represent him, it shows him in this suit, right? This suit which was so important to him. And why do we always find him in this proper suit? Another thing we learn from looking at the Baroda State Archives is that when is the first time that Dr. Ambedkar wears a proper suit, the suit that has become historic, that we all know him as? It is because in his agreement with Bombay State, when they sent him to Columbia, Columbia was a very aristocratic place. You don't just show up there dressed like I am right now. You show up in a proper suit and tie. And so part of his agreement was he was given an outfit allowance, a quantum of money in order to buy a proper suit so that he could attend Columbia University in style. And Ambedkar took to that suit And so from 1930, because of this Baroda agreement, till 1956, of course, we always found him properly dressed. And this is how we represent him today. So these very small, things like Baroda, they caused him to weep at the social level, but they had such a powerful impact in various different ways in his life experiences.
That was truly intriguing, sir. Sir, taking the discussion from lived experience to a bit of theoretical debate, while discussing the Bahishkrit Hitkarni Sabha, you provide a critique of Christoph Jaffalot's take on Ambedkar. Jaffalot believed that Ambedkar of the 1920s had a Sanskritization tendency in his work for upliftment of the marginalized. You, of course, critique Jaffalot's Eurocentric perspective. So can you shed some light on what you make of Jaffalot's take, a Eurocentric approach on such issues, and the alleged Brahminical features of Ambedkar's early actions?
Yes, I think Professor Jaffalot is a friend. So I have trouble, criticizing him too much in a public forum, but as you know, I don't spare him in the book. I don't spare anyone because I'm in pursuit of, laying down what I think are the authentic details. Jaffalot is a brilliant scholar, but I do feel that maybe it is just his, social location, his background. He articulates what I often hear, which is that, and I actually wrote a book about this called Indian Political Theory on Swaraj, finding an alternative between this idea that, tradition or modernization, and modernization means westernization. So Jaffalot takes this notion that Ambedkar moved from tradition, which is Sanskrit-based culture, Sanskrit, and he moves to modernization, which is westernization. And as I wrote in the book, in Political Theory, extensively, this is a dualism that I completely reject. And it is a Eurocentric outlook on the world. And unfortunately, Eurocentrism is so prevalent in Indian scholarship also, colonized minds. So that's all, that dichotomy is often repeated. One does not need to choose between tradition and Western. And when one says modernization, it does not mean westernization. And when one says tradition, it does not need to mean Brahminism. And this was so powerfully felt by Ambedkar himself that in 1953, 54, 55, 56, he wrote a history of India in 7 volumes. It's never been published. It's incomplete. But 7 volumes, can you imagine? That's called Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Ancient India. And the thesis of that book, of those 7 books, is that the entire history of India has been a struggle for equality. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that the idea, which we often hear, that equality is a Western notion, that our freedom fighters, they all got educated in England and they bring back these Western values, that shows that this is a very superficial and Eurocentric idea. If Dr. Ambedkar is arguing that the very origin of Buddhism in the ancient world is the origin of the self-conscious pursuit of the principle of equality. That means the entire history of India is a history of the struggle for equality, which means it has nothing to do with the West. So I think Jaffalot is locked into a dichotomy which is very common in the social sciences, but which Dr. Ambedkar rejected back in the 1950s, and which, I take Dr. Ambedkar's side on this one.
Thank you, sir. That was indeed an intriguing insight. My next question to you is that, in your book you have discussed the 2 struggles of Ambedkar's life. One was the conference of Malegaon and one was the conference of Nagpur of 1920. And you mentioned that these 2 movements marked Babasaheb's entry into local level politics. And while doing so, he challenged the other untouchable leaders as well as the touchable well-wishers of the Dalits. But we often see nowadays that non-Dalits, they assume the leadership of the Dalit outfits, particularly the political groups. So my question to you, sir, is that do you think that this is an appropriation of Dalit movement by the non-Dalits?
Yes, that's not something I think, that's a fact. This is the era of the appropriation of Ambedkar. No question about that. As much as I delight in the fact that in the last 6 months, 6 books about Ambedkar have been published, my own, that of Ashok Gopal, that of Shashi Tharoor, Scott Stroud's book, Savita Ambedkar's Marathi autobiography has been translated into English, recently published by Penguin, and Ambedkar in London by Jaffarlaw and others. So this is just a feast. You know, it shows the globalization of Ambedkar and his impact around the world. And yet, pay attention to the fact that of all those 6 books, not a single Dalit writer is among them. And so it's a cause for celebration, but it's a cause for concern. Now, I know all of these people, and so I can say that their interests are sincere and they're not trying to appropriate out of self-interest. But when you look at the wider world, academic centers for social inclusion, Ambedkar chairs around India and the world, you know, all of these kinds of institutions that are designed or created to provide opportunities for Dalit Bahujan academics and intellectuals and so on, they're all occupied by oppressor caste people. So, you know, I myself was offered the Ambedkar chair at Columbia University more than a decade ago, and I said, why would I take the Ambedkar chair at Columbia? That should be for Dalit. Now, 11 years have passed. 10 years in a row, non-Dalit appointed to that chair. It's repulsive. So, and that's not, you know, that's not our, when I worked at Delhi University, I had a salary of 25,000 rupees a month. That pays, you know, 100 times that. So everyone is in the process of appropriating Ambedkar, not just politicians and political parties, but intellectuals, academics. And I myself, not being from the community, have to be constantly vigilant of, you know, overstepping my bounds, and I have to ensure that I do everything I can to include people from the community in every possible way. It's an obligation, but in politics is a very dirty game, and so the appropriation of Ambedkar from left, right, center in politics, that's something that no one is going to limit themselves like an academic or an intellectual will. They'll run roughshod until they squeeze everything they can out of the movement.
Sir, drawing inspiration from another of your work, in Ambedkar's preamble, you have made the point that the history of the preamble is, in many ways, also the history of Dr. Ambedkar. That his life experiences and pursuit of justice played a major role in the formulation of justice of constitution and constitutionalism in India. So can you elaborate a bit on the same? Furthermore, did that work inspire you to come up with this biography of Babasaheb, or are there any connections between the two works?
Yes, there's a connection, but I started working on becoming Babasaheb, or the Ambedkar biography, back 10 years ago when I had published the Buddha and His Dhamma critical edition. Buddha and His Dhamma was, of course, Dr. Ambedkar's greatest work, completed just days before he died and published posthumously. And in that publication, there was a preface that he had written that was suppressed because of what it stated about his wife, Savita Ambedkar, and how much he owed to her. And there were people who didn't like Savita Ambedkar and even had a conspiracy that she was responsible for his death and so on. So when I was working on this critical edition of the Buddha and His Dhamma, finding all of the sources and Ambedkar's inspiration in the Pali canon and the Buddhist text to try to see where his Buddhism comes from, I found that his autobiography very much influences what he writes and why he writes it. And so that I take into Ambedkar's preamble to show that every concept of significance has a genealogy in his lived experiences. And the most important of which are, of course, fraternity and dignity. two concepts that don't appear anywhere else in the history of the independence movement in India. Those two words, and we can even focus in on fraternity. Fraternity was a single-handed contribution of Ambedkar that forces us to understand the entire spirit of the Constitution and what it's supposed to be about. And fraternity in Ambedkar is, of course, ultimately Maitri or Metta, loving kindness, the way that one Indian, irrespective of social background, state, linguistic community, class, needs to treat another Indian, irrespective of region, language, caste, community, class, gender, sexuality, and so on. That is the heart of Ambedkar's understanding of the Constitution, and it is the heart of his personal journey. And so I've only continued that. Ambedkar's preamble was, I focused between 1947 and 1950. This, I'm trying to get 1891 to 1956.
So, in the preface of this book, which was titled There Will Be Blood, you mentioned that all of the biographies of Babasaheb, which have been produced till date, have not presented Babasaheb in flesh and blood. They've just focused on what he has done. They've not focused on what he was, how he thought. And you mentioned that there were two primary sources. One, obviously, we discussed Dhananjay Keel's biography. Another was C.V. Khairmodi's 14 volumes. Now that you've written this work, so my question to you is that, how do you see this work changing the Ambedkarite literature? And another question is that, what are your plans for the second volume, which you just now shared with us, would be titled Passion of Ambedkar?
Yes, so, a writer, there must be many writers or aspiring writers in the audience with us. A writer is not really responsible for what happens once you push it out. So I can't anticipate or expect how it's going to change anyone or anything in a Ambedkar scholarship or otherwise. It has a life of its own at this point. But why I'm trying to bring blood into this Ambedkar's life. Becoming Babasaheb has a pun, a play on words. Obviously, my focus is on how young Diva became Babasaheb. At the same time, the idealization and demigod status of Ambedkar, looming so large over all of us, has its role, of course. I belong to a family that does pray to Ambedkar, and we see him as a larger-than-life figure, and I respect that. At the same time, given what India is going through today, given what some authors have called undeclared emergency, but however you want to take it, even if you are a supporter of the current regime and so on, we do recognize a polarization that has become very dangerous, whichever political ideology you belong to. In this circumstance, one has to realize that it was a flesh and blood person who escaped by his wit, by his intelligence, by his persistence, and by luck, conditions that are worse than our own. You think that 1910 was better than 2023? Not at all. He transcended constraints and conditions that were more oppressive, more violent, more dangerous, more treacherous than even us today. And so I feel by humanizing Ambedkar, we can be inspired that we should not be completely full of despair and despondence. We can witness that this was a flesh and blood person who emerged, and maybe we can do something similar, becoming Babasaheb-like. So that's why I wanted to present him with blood and a beating heart, because he's an inspiration for us to follow. If he can do it, maybe I can do it, or someone I know can do it if I lend my support or something like that. Something that, like what he achieved, can be achieved again, because he was a man.
As you mentioned, the book mentions, we need to understand Ambedkar in flesh and blood as well. Of course, I haven't read the book entirely, to be honest, but I have read most chunks of it. And the one thing that I can vouch for is that it does provide a brilliant, fresh perspective on how and how to view Ambedkar as a person. And I think that exhausts our question actually.
Now, we will just open the floor for the audience. If anybody from the audience has any question to ask. I would request our volunteers to please provide a mic.
Hello sir, my name is Arnav Anand Gupta. I am from Political Science Honours, 3rd years. My question to you is the second round table conference when Babasaheb Ambedkar and Mahatma Gandhi were there. Mahatma Gandhi struck a deal with Muslim League that they can agree, International Congress can agree on separate electorate if the Muslim League agrees that the scheduled caste will not have the separate electorate. So this is a very intriguing one. Why did Mahatma Gandhi agree to give separate electorate to Muslim League, but he didn't agree to give that to the scheduled caste? So your work is on Babasaheb Ambedkar, but my question primarily goes towards the Gandhi. But since it's a kind of engagement between the two figures, and you must have done research on that, I would like to know your view. What was going on in Mahatma Gandhi's mind, and why did he strike a deal with Muslim League to thwart the attempt by Babasaheb? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think I'm flattered that you think I can know what's in Mahatma Gandhi's mind. If I had that ability, I don't think I would be bothering with anyone here today. I would be on the moon or something. I don't know. I have an opinion which comes directly from a book that Ambedkar wrote. I was smiling when you asked your question, because when you said, why did Mahatma Gandhi agree for separate electorates for the Muslim League and refuse that to the scheduled castes? You know that is a question that Ambedkar himself asked. Why did he do it? And in this case, and why not that? And he wrote a book about it, what Congress and Gandhi have done to the untouchables. And in that book, which you can download for free from the MEA, for example, website online, he gives a comprehensive answer to that question. And I would defer to Ambedkar's response in that book from 1945, I believe, because it gives you a very detailed reply. But thank you for the great compliment of thinking that I have that that much knowledge. I'm afraid I don't.
Sir, I thought that it's in the offing. Your next book might talk about that.
Yes, of course I will. I will discuss it very intimately in the next book. If you're asking for a sneak preview of the next book, I can tell you that the position I take there is from Ambedkar's 1945 view on the matter.
Good evening, sir. Shabim to one and all. Sir, in the preface of becoming Babasaheb, you have mentioned the process that you went through while coming up with the book. You mentioned how you visited all the places where Babasaheb himself had lived and worked during the course of his life. Since it's a book, as you yourself claim, a more personalized account, apart from the biographies that are in the market, who are more intellectual biographies, I would like to know what is your personalized experience of living in those places, because you have not emphasized enough on that. So if more insights could be gained from you on that, I would love you to share with the audience here. Thank you so much.
That's a very interesting question. Not too long ago, I was at Asiatic Society in Mumbai having a conversation about becoming Babasaheb. And when I was introducing why I was so happy to be at Asiatic Society, because it's housed in Town Hall, in other words, where the Bombay Legislative Council met. And Dr. Ambedkar had entered, he had cut his teeth in that same building, and in fact in that same room where we were having this book launch, book discussion. Ambedkar, you know, parliamentary bodies are they have a lot of rules and protocols, and coming from outside and entering into a parliament, you have no idea who's supposed to speak, when do you speak, how do you address other people, when is your time, what are the topics. You know, all of these protocols are totally baffling. So Ambedkar could not possibly have been as effective as he was in the Constituent Assembly, where there's so much protocol, rules, and procedures, had he not cut his teeth in a legislative body like the Bombay Legislative Council, which was in that building, town hall, the Asiatic Society, and I described this. The reason I mentioned it is because I was having a conversation with Shashi Tharoor there, and he leaned over to me and he said, Aakash, I'm getting shivers, how do you call it, goose pimples or whatever. I'm getting shivers realizing that Babasaheb was right here in this room where we're talking about him now. And as I describe that to you, I'm getting them also. It happens when you are in the footsteps of a world historical figure such as that, especially one who means a lot to you. It is a very moving experience. And I think what impact it has had on my writing is that it allows me to know how to make the right decision about what to say, what to be silent about, what to deny, you know, if I feel like Ambedkar's been attacked falsely, you know, what to address and so on. I feel like it gives all of that time walking in the footsteps of Ambedkar. You know, people thought I was crazy in London when I would walk every path that he had walked, you know, between his house and his library, between the dormitory and the British Library, between LSE and Gray's Inn. And, you know, I walked them all and I timed myself and I made maps and I wanted to see which way he would have walked and all of this. And everyone thought I was, you know, I'd gone mad. But the reason is that you see what he saw along those walks and what he must have been thinking about it. It helps you in some way guide you on the choices that you make as a writer, as a biographer, of what he might have thought was important, what he might have thought was insignificant, and so on. So I don't talk about it explicitly because this is not a book about me, right? It's a book about him. But I think it's visible, or apparent rather, in the book that the author of the book had spent so much time walking in his footsteps. At least I hope it is.
Due to paucity of time, I'm sorry we won't be able to take any more questions. But it was amazing talking to you, sir.
Not even a critical one? Someone must be...
Any critical?
Just the opposition always has to have their opportunity, right? Do you mind?
Sir,
yeah.
Any critical question?
So you mentioned about Ambedkar's distant relations with Marxism in later part of his life. And we know that Ambedkar was more of a Fabian socialist because he admired John Dewey, who was an American Fabian, and they believed in the idea of, educating the classes so that they can, somehow become liberated. And this was seen even in the Congress, where Nehru was a Fabian socialist, a strong Fabian socialist. But post 75 years after independence, a lot of these academic circles, as you have said, are filled with people who believe in the same thing, but are usually of the oppressor classes in general. So how has that even led to the liberation of people in that aspect? Or the very community, those who they strive to, take out of the impoverishment?
Very good question, but not a critical one. But I'll just suggest that everyone here, we all get along lovingly, so we can leave aside that. You have a critique, you tell me after. Fabian socialism, I would disagree with you slightly. They were all influenced very much by it, but I would never say that Ambedkar was himself a Fabian socialist. I think that's too much of an emphasis. I don't think Ambedkar was a pragmatist, even though Scott Stroud is my very close friend and I've learned a great deal from him. I would never say Ambedkar is a pragmatist as he argues in that book. There are certain things one can say that Ambedkar was a Buddhist, no question about that. But was he a Fabian socialist? I don't think so. But yes, of course, you have recognized how much he draws from those traditions. The irony of contemporary intellectual classes clinging to those ideas while organizing their social lives in manners that are totally opposed to the material upliftment of the people they claim to have sympathy and charity for. I think the explanation is just that if you don't have that lived experience, then you have the constant risk of falling back into your class, falling back into your comfort, and falling back into your socialization. Because we are socialized differently. Not explicitly, we're not ideologically casteist, but we grow up in an ambiance of implicit casteism. And if you don't belong to the Dalit Bahujan community, then you certainly grow up in that. And it's very easy unconsciously to fall back into it, to slip back into it, when you're not actively working for the cause. Sometimes even when you are working for the cause. So I think it's kind of a fallback. If you don't have the lived experience of this profound prejudice, then you're privileged, and your privilege will always be your shadow. It will always be your shadow, whether your ideology is Marxism or Fabian socialism or what have you. Thank you all very much. I hope we learned something, and if anyone wants to fight, we'll fight outside.
It was indeed a pleasure for us, sir, to have you with us. I think Rahul can take over from here.
With this, now we have come to the end of this session. Thank you so much, sir. It was an honor for us and the entire Hindu College to have you here with us today, sir. Now I would like to call upon Mudita Mishra, the Vice President of Caucus, to felicitate Professor Rathore and present him with a token of appreciation. With this, we now come to the end of Campus 2023, and I come to the end of my speech. My sincere thanks to all of you for your presence and patience. Hoping to see you all and host you next year as well. Go Caucus! Go Caucus!